Okay, Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to another live session with us. Today we have a very special guest with us today. We have with us Adrian Zenz, joining us all the way from the USA, Minneapolis to be specific. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Very good. Adrian is a senior fellow in China Studies at Victims of Communism. He specifically researches Xinjiang and Tibet. He's an author, researcher, and today we're going to talk about his most recent research that has everyone talking. He's been inundated with interviews. I'm so glad he's given me, the next half hour to discuss this. Research called Sterilizations, Forced Abortions, and Mandatory Birth Control. Basically, could you just start us off with how you came about? Obviously, we've heard that this is a collaborative effort with yourself, AP, open source resourcing. Start us off, please.
Yes, well, thank you for having me on this show. It's my pleasure and privilege. And this particular research came out of initial evidence that I discovered last year, and others also, that Uyghur population growth rates were suspiciously low and had declined dramatically, actually, in 2017 and especially 18. And it was my interest to investigate the situation further. Initially, I thought that maybe the dramatic internment campaign could be the primary explanatory factor for this, together with a sort of an enforcement of existing policies. However, in the course of this report, I uncovered quite unexpectedly, I must add, evidence of a much more systematic state campaign to suppress Uyghur birth rates and even to have population growth targets that would, quite frankly, point us in the direction of what we might refer to as demographic genocide, near zero population growth, etc. At the same time, I've also had an interest in population statistics and understanding also the whole debate of ethnic settler colonialism in Xinjiang, the question of Han Chinese being brought in to the region, and ethnic proportions. And I made a discovery or two in that respect as well.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? We do have to call it a genocide, don't we? People are labeling it different things. I just want to put up a clip that Louisa Grieve from the Uyghur Human Rights Project had an interview earlier on Al Jazeera. Let's see what she's got to say about it.
Some experts are calling this demographic genocide. Do you agree with the use of that term?
It's an excellent term. And in fact, there's no reason to put any adjective in front of genocide, like cultural genocide. This prevention of births on a systematic scale among the Uyghurs, the Uyghur population in China, by the Chinese government, it exactly fits the definition of genocide under international law.
Adrian, I mean, for the longest time, we've been trying to convince the world to call this a genocide. Activists like myself and others, we could scream genocide and we can have testimonies. But for you for a researcher like you to put this on paper and show the world, show the CCP with their own evidence, isn't it about time that the world does call it a genocide and not be wishy-washy with certain terminology?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The term genocide is a very big term. It is so loaded precisely because of its implication, and therefore it should also be used after careful determination. If we use terms like genocide very easily, they become quite meaningless. If we use them very carefully and rigorously, they retain their full meaning. It is my opinion that I would agree that the Uyghurs have had clear impressions about what is going on here. And that is a good thing. And there have been insights and witness accounts. On the matter of genocide, I would like to say a thing or two. I think it is accurate that so far we have been describing this as a cultural genocide, because that has been the primary focus. If you look at what Hitler did to the Jews, you could predict what he did by looking at his ideology. His ideology was to frame the Jews as a threat, a danger, and to be eradicated. And that's what he did. Now, the CCP has a, I don't want to say any better ideology, but a different ideology. The ideology of the CCP is to integrate these little inferior ethnic minorities into their, basically what is like a continuation of past empires. It's a multi-ethnic Han Chinese-led empire. And this requires assimilation. Now, if the CCP had wanted to annihilate its minorities, it could have very easily done so at any time. I personally have heard stories of Tibetan villages being decimated at gunpoint. And possibly something similar happened in places elsewhere as well. I continue to believe that the main purpose of the CCP is not to physically eradicate or erase any of its ethnic minorities, including the Uyghurs. I believe the goal is to fully and brutally and thoroughly assimilate the Uyghurs to the extent to which we are having to look for new terminology. Existing terminology does not quite capture it. We're trying to describe it as a soft genocide, a cultural genocide, an ethnocide. I think ethnocide is quite a good word in a number of ways. It's a hollowing out of a minority. So hollowing out the inside, the core, and the spirituality, and only leaving the outer shell. That you can call ethnocide, you can call genocide, you can call it cultural genocide. You will have higher mortality as a result of internment camps, that's for sure. Now, the latest findings, what are they saying about the situation? The latest findings now, for the first time clearly proven, tick a box of the classic United Nations Genocide Convention. For the first time, of course, yes, we have had anecdotal evidence. Now we kind of have any proof that we need, basically. So, hence my proposition to move towards a term something like demographic genocide, which is not well defined. It's not a legal term, but it means we're going now at least one step beyond cultural genocide. I do not advocate that we call this genocide with no adjective. Why? Well, maybe I love precision, because I think the Uyghurs are better served if we call it what it is. And I do not believe that the destruction of the Uyghur human being, warm bodies, is the goal. That would be point-blank genocide with no adjective. Demographic genocide is a direct attack on the physical population, not wiping it out, but keep stunting its growth, reducing it to an extent, stifling it, keeping it at the same level. So I would say this is a cultural genocide that has now moved to also be a demographic genocide in a strategy of ethno-racial domination, because we have firstly the suppression of birth, secondly anecdotal indication of coercion of inter-ethnic marriage between Uyghurs and Han for ethnic dilution, and thirdly a mass strategy of bringing Han Chinese settlers into Xinjiang, approximately 2 million between 2015 and 18, according to official statistics. 2 million persons who have come out from other parts of China into the region, who do not have a local household registration, and who have all settled in Han majority regions. So we have a settler colonialism, a strategy of ethno-racial domination. That's maybe a long-winded way, and I think what the Uyghurs, I want to empathize. The Uyghurs, I'm certain, and I'm not Uyghur, the Uyghurs, I'm certain, feel that this is like a genocide. Because it's so horrific, and it's like the destruction of, it's a point blank frontal attack on Uyghur identity. And so, of course, why the inclination to use the strongest language possible. And maybe it feels like, how can a Uyghur live? So I see the blending, I see the emotion, and I empathize with it very deeply.
So, so in your humble opinion, you would say, unless there's straight up, hey guys, come outside, we're going to execute you right then and there, unless we see this sort of thing happening, in your opinion, it's not a full-blown genocide in that sense. However, I do understand the fact that you say they are destroying us from within, and you have this human shell that they're going to fill in with CCP, redness, propaganda, political ideas. So that's why you've called it a demographic genocide. If you could just, for the next minute or so, just give us the specifics of what, because it's the first time I've heard of such a term. It hasn't really been delved into. In the next minute or so, could you just give us your definition of what a demographic genocide is then, please?
A demographic genocide has not been properly defined. It's been used to demarcate when there is the attempt to suppress births or to outbirth one ethnic group with another. So to have like an ethnic competition, although I don't think that's actually a very good definition. I think we might want to almost have to create our own new definition. In my opinion, demographic genocide fits the fact that we are seeing just this one particular criterion of genocide fulfilled so clearly and fully. The other four criteria are, there's some partial fulfillment. We have higher death rates due to internment. We have the transfer of children from one ethnic group to another. Boarding schools do that in a sense. Again, it's kind of, sort of, but what is the intention? I think the key is, what is the intention? Demographic genocide fits with the strategy of ethno-racial supremacy that is behind this. It's a little bit like the term concentration camp. Do you call the camps concentration camp? You can. It's technically correct because they concentrate people in camps. Technically, you can say they're concentration camps. Is it the most helpful term? In my opinion, academically, no, because it's too generic. Many dictatorships use concentration camps to concentrate people in camps, but why? For what purpose? Hitler did it to kill people. Others did it to kill people over time. The CCP use it to indoctrinate people, and some of them end up dying. Now, demographic genocide also has the aspect of a slow, and this has also been argued, like a slow genocide. Where will this lead over a long time, over generations for the Uyghurs? I believe the CCP wants always there to be Uyghurs as part of China, but what kind ones, right? So it would even, if even just young generations survive, that would be enough for them, frankly. What I'm saying is, they are, most certainly the CCP is capable of full genocide, there's no doubt about it. But that's not their strategy. That might be plan B for them. Plan B if plan A fails. I think plan A for the CCP is not genocide, it's a Chinese nation where the Uyghurs are fully and brutally subjugated and assimilated, and coupled with a strategy of ethno-racial supremacy. And I know sometimes the term ethnic cleansing is also used, but ethnic cleansing actually doesn't work, because ethnic cleansing means you cleanse areas of ethnicity, like you cleanse an area, but that's not what they're doing, right? They're not cleansing southern Xinjiang of Uyghurs. In fact, they've done the opposite. They've forced Uyghurs from all over China to go back to southern Xinjiang. They've concentrated them in order to control them better. So again, the main takeaway point is the Chinese Communist Party is doing a new form of atrocity. It's like, one could almost call it, like maybe provocatively call it a Holocaust 2.0, an atrocity 2.0. it is the 21st century version of what it is trying to do.
I just want to focus on this chart for a second. It's quite interesting. We've got the Uyghurs in blue, the Han in orange. We could obviously see what happened here between 65 and 75. Han population growth succeeds Uyghur growth. But then we have between 75 and 85. Obviously, in 79, 80, you have the one-child policy for the Chinese, and then the two-child policy for the Uyghurs. But then between 95 and 2005, the Han supersede the Uyghur. But then between 2005 and 2015, the opposite happens. Could you highlight a bit more what's happening in this chart that you've decided to highlight?
Yes, I certainly can. This
Please.
chart shows a combination of natural population growth through births and in-migration. And anytime the Han are higher than the Uyghurs, that's because of in-migration, not because of higher birth rates.
Right.
So you see a massive, in the early times, massive Han in-migration. Yeah. As soon as this in-migration slows down, and as you also correctly said, Han family planning was stricter, you see the Uyghurs gaining the upper hand in terms of population growth. Now, between 1995 and 2005, you had the Great Western Development Project, where the governments was spending billions on developing the West, the entire West. And in the wake of that, there were new jobs, new opportunities, and new incentives. So you had a lot more in-migration, which explains the higher Han population change rate. But then between 2005 and 2015, Xinjiang became a lot less attractive for the Han. Han population, Han birth rates fell in the entire country with modernization, I guess, including in Xinjiang, and Uyghur birth rates increased significantly. Okay,
very interesting. So you believe that the end goal is not for basically or at least at the moment, for the CCP not to totally eradicate physically the Uyghurs, but just to keep this shell sort of a Chinese version of Uyghurs. Where to from now? I mean, this is not the first time that you've brought this evidence to us. Obviously, you were one of the main authors of the Karakash list. We had a trove of leaked documents. You played a major role in that. What do you foresee the CCP will do now in East Turkestan?
The CCP is already moving to its long-term strategy of consolidating social control and consolidating assimilation. I see that the CCP is on the one hand trying to contain and control the adult Uyghur population, having fully intimidated, broken their souls, putting them into coercive labor. The strategy is to break apart the nuclear family, because cultural and spiritual inheritance takes place very primarily in the nuclear family and also in communities. Those are broken apart through coercive full-time labor for all adults and the children in full-time boarding institutions. And the strategy is to capture the young generation, to sever them from their roots, and to raise a young generation that's changed along the lines of the CCP. And the adult ones can't do anything about it, because if they said even one thing, it will be their end.
Now, there is talk, especially China has said that they've closed these concentration camps, and many Uyghurs, I know some people around me, have been able to get in contact with their family members again. Do you believe the notion or the locking up of individuals, has that ended, or have they just been moved into different areas? As you mentioned, forced labor camps, or there was an article in Radio Free Asia saying that they were moved into no man's land, these pieces of land where nobody exists. What's actually happening, do you think? And second part to the question, back regarding Karakash again, this chart showing that the main reason the Uyghurs were put into concentration camps was because of high birth rates. So two-parter here. Sorry.
Sure. So yes, we see a shift towards long-term control in industrial parks, in forced labor, where they live on dormitories, these are also secure compounds with barbed wire and cameras. So it's like a different kind of, you could almost call it a different type of internment. The open air prison of the region comes in different shapes and forms. So a release that's not really a release, so to speak. This is one component. But I'm also quite concerned that Xinjiang's internment system is much bigger than the vocational camps. And there are all kinds of transformations through education camps that we have no idea, really, about numbers, about developments, about changes. The Karakash list shows many of those in the vocational camps have been shifted, released, quote unquote, into coercive social observation and forced labor. Now, some nightlight satellite data shows that some of them might have been filled up with new incomers, right? Possibly from the worst types of camps. You know, those who get more points and behave well might get shifted to the vocational camps. On the other hand, many have been sentenced to long prison terms. And on the other hand, you have the forced labor scheme is bigger than the internment system. You have the training of rural surplus laborers in short-term closed centralized vocational training, which is not unlike really an internment camp. So you have so many different kinds of control and internment that the situation on the ground is really quite complicated, and it's very hard to assess.
Okay. Do you believe now, I mean, you've had your work quoted by Secretary Pompeo, you had IPAC in the UK, you had various organizations. Do you see anything tangible happening, actual pressure being put onto the CCP? Do you think this will happen?
Well, hopefully. There's been preciously little of that, preciously little. The American government has taken steps. It has initiated the Uyghur Policy Act, although that one came at least 1 year too late, but still better something than nothing. State Department has blacklisted a number of companies over their involvement in Xinjiang. United States Customs and Border Protection have, again, blacklisted companies, etc. So those are things the American government has done. What I'm really looking for from the United States government is much stronger action, especially on forced labor, and also actually an appraisal, calling it crimes against humanity as a first step. That's like one step below genocide, is crimes against humanity. This determination nobody has done. And that is a huge problem. Now, of course, the other places, other countries have done even less. So it's all downhill from there. So now we can really hope that with the new appraisal and now determining to what extent is this moving into literal genocide, I hope that this can now get the ball rolling a little bit. Also, the world has had more insight about the nature of the Communist Party in the context of the virus pandemic. Attitudes towards China have changed. The appraisal towards Beijing has become more realistic, more pragmatic. Interdependence on trade and economic profit is in some way no longer necessarily the first priority. And those are good signs. What that means for the Uyghurs, we'll have to see. At the end of the day, it comes down to moral spine, doesn't it? I mean, my goodness, I could slam my fist on the table. If anybody really cared about human rights, why haven't I mean, how many more reports am I going to produce? I mean,
exactly.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
You have a very popular quote. I've used your quote on interviews as well, where you say this is the largest internment of an ethno-religious group since the Holocaust or since World War II. Now, here at Talk to East Turkestan, we are we practice non-violent ways to shed light upon what is happening to the Uyghur people of East Turkestan. But do you think a sort of US and the Allied forces, or do you see this a replay of a physical sort of this thing going to war for this CCP machine to stop? Do you see this happening?
Well, 6 months ago, the appraisal of that question might have been different 6 months ago than it is now, with an increasingly aggressive and belligerent China looking at the border between China and India. I think the danger of some kind of at least localized armed conflict as a result of Chinese aggression has evidently increased. I think it's very unlikely that any other country, including the United States, would proactively engage in armed conflict. Neither would I advocate this unless it was unavoidable. But your guess is as good as mine. With things escalating, although I think it is more likely it's going to be a Cold War, I envision China is only going to, I think, engage much smaller countries or countries where it thinks it can have the upper hand, sink a couple of fishing vessels off Vietnam and the Philippines and stuff like this. But if pressed hard and the CCP thinks they can go in, they probably will, because they've become quite confident and the military is better and better. But none of this, I think, would hold any promise for the situation of the Uyghurs.
Okay. Well, before we leave you, obviously, as I mentioned before, the CCP absolutely loves you, loves the work you do, right? Calls you a crusader. What do you say to those comments saying that you are a radical Christian and that you're out to get the Chinese and you're spreading all this fake news? Because obviously they cannot stand up to the evidence. They have nothing to rebuttal you on. I wanted your take on this. I want to leave on a light note, basically.
Well, there certainly is a sweet irony to the fact that they're trying to deflect criticism of their religious persecution by launching accusations of religious extremism against researchers such as myself. Well, I mean, what else are they going to do? Beijing has nothing to say against strong research and findings. They absolutely have no other strategy than cheap stabs at character assassination. If they do that, so be it. I don't really care, to be frank. This is a very important cause, and it's important research, and I like doing research, and the findings speak for themselves. That's really the best kind of research. If you simply do it, you do it well, you put it out, and the results speak for themselves, and others can report on it if they choose so. I think that's what I do, and I have sort of nothing to add to that. And I continue to hold on to my faith, which I think is very important, and I'm very glad that the Uyghurs have faith. And I think this is actually something that distinguishes us from a government that has a very low view on human value. And we must recognize this, that their view will never be the same. But at the same time, let us not malign Beijing or the Chinese officials. Let's actually love our enemies and extend grace to other human beings who often act out of desperation, quite frankly. I know it's easy for me to say I've not been in an internment camp and I have no family in internment, but that'll be my take on this, just to act graciously and to maintain our personal integrity. And I think that's our foundation. Well, we will try. I don't see how, from a Uyghurs perspective, that'll be very difficult. But thank you so much for your time. The Uyghurs really appreciate the work you do. You put things on paper, make it tangible. You make governments speak up. You keep the Uyghurs in the spotlight, shedding light on the greatest atrocity happening, in my view, in the 21st century at the moment. Thank you so much for your time. I want to thank all the viewers. Make sure, guys, to share, like this video, get this message out there. I hope to have Dr. Adrian Zenz back very soon. He's been inundated, and I'm just so thankful that he gave us, half an hour of his busy day. Thank you so much, and peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Doctor. Well, thank you, and all the best.